Yeah, though the messages that are coming through is that Julia Gillard lied about a carbon tax, the cost of living pressures are out there, and now who's really running the country? We'll pick up on that issue now. Here's Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard.
Whether it's climate change or gay marriage, the Greens are in charge and Bob Brown is the real Prime Minister of this country.
I understand that there have been media reports that during the discussion about this legislation yesterday that someone raised with me concerns about the influence of the Greens on the government. That report is completely untrue. No caucus member has ever raised such concerns with me.
And I might not have raised it directly with her, but there are enough reports around to suggest that some of these backbenchers are raising it with the media.
Yeah, I think the core thing here about this legislation is Labor has previously supported withdrawing the power of a minister to override legislation passed.
Yeah, just before you go on there, Simon Crean explains this about the real impact of the legislation that we're talking about here, and that is the bill that impacts on the territories. Here he is.
The question is, what's the mechanism for override? At the moment, the Parliament can override or a minister can override. The effect of the bill is to simply take away the power of the minister to override. The power of the Parliament to override still exists.
Right, your point, Brian?
That was the point I was making.
Yeah.
Equally, some of the things they're talking about will automatically somehow or other come in, like euthanasia, that the Greens will somehow or other be able to bring it in. They don't have anything like a majority in the ACT territory parliament. There's only 2 occasions in Australia where someone has tried in a territory to bring in a euthanasia bill, and successfully did so in the Northern Territory, which was led by the Chief Minister at the time, Marshall Perrin, was a Conservative, and in the ACT, Kate Carnell, who was a Conservative. So the two times we've seen a bill come in, it's been by Conservatives.
And it wasn't only Simon Crean who made that point. On Wednesday on Neil Mitchell's show, Tony Abbott made exactly the same point. He said this isn't about the principle of gay marriage, this isn't about the principle of euthanasia, this is a governance issue, and we're looking at it in that light. Now, he changed his mind a bit the next day when there was a bit of fear among some of the Labor senators who thought that it was all about gay marriage, and he used it as part of this, the Greens are running the country argument.
And as the only resident of a territory here on the couch this morning, I'd like to say that I think we should have as much of a right as any state to pass our own laws. And I find it quite astonishing, these arguments that are being run, that it's somehow sneaky or undemocratic for the full federal parliament, both houses, to have the power to override a territory law just as they have the power to override a state law. I mean, what's sneaky about that? Why is that the Greens dominating
Just
things?
on that, let's look at the Canberra Times page one editorial where they had to go back at the Australian, and it said that because the ACTs, because the Territorians are educated, tertiary educated, and they're public sector dominated electorate, they don't always match the wider community's values and so on. Therefore, according to the Canberra Times, they're being told that they should be muzzled.
Well, I mean,
You're too educated.
I believe absolutely that you should never talk down to voters, that you should never suggest that a group of voters doesn't have full democratic rights or the ability to make their own decisions because they're less educated. But I don't think tertiary education should be somehow a disqualification. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Also, we're supposed to have a federal system of government in which, and for very good reasons, you don't have centralised power deciding everything. It's actually a healthier society where you've got diversity than where you've got conformity normally. So I'm astonished that these 3 Labor senators who are supposed to, under the Constitution, represent their states, I can't believe that they would go into the Prime Minister and say, look, by the way, I want the right to override what the South Australian Parliament does or the New South Wales Parliament does.
And then it's just to emphasise that point again, as it stands at the moment, executive government can overrule the territories. And what they're saying is, no, the Parliament should overrule. So there's still an overriding mechanism in place.
There is. A democratic overriding mechanism.
That's how our system's supposed to work. The pinnacle is supposed to be the legislative branch, the Parliament. But we've got so used to the idea of executive power running everything. I think this is a very healthy step back from that.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Adelaide in the 1970s, during which time the Parliament in South Australia legalised abortion and decriminalised homosexuality ahead of any other parliament in the country. I think there would have been an absolute revolution if the federal parliament had stepped into South Australia's affairs and overturned those laws. I mean, it's a real nonsense what's being argued.
Mind you, because the politics of it is that when the three senators went to see the Prime Minister and basically forced her to send this off to a committee, Labor scored an amazing own goal on this issue. Instead of sticking with their position that made absolute sense, they handed the coalition another thing to argue that the Greens were running the government, when, in fact, the facts don't suggest that that's the case.
And also, unless I've got it wrong, my understanding is the opinion polls show that people, in fact, do support so-called gay marriage or same-sex marriage, and they support euthanasia. So I don't think there's a lot of votes in trying to stop a territory parliament bringing in either of those things.
What's the position, though, within the major parties? I mean, both major parties will be divided on this issue, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and so, if you did have the position come up where the Parliament was being asked whether or not it would override a territory law, you would have what, in my view, is a perfectly correct position where members of the parties would probably vote with their consciences on an issue that is effectively, in both cases, a conscience issue.
But it still feeds into this perception that the opposition can run, that the Greens are calling the shots, because suddenly it's an issue. And why is it an issue?
Because Labor made it an issue.
But the Greens aren't running the country. Nothing can get to be law in this country unless a majority of the Parliament pass it. As simple as that.
Well, but it also must be said that there's this sort of some kind of surprise and horror that the Greens have more of a say than they did maybe in the last Parliament or the one before that. Well, that's what happened. That's what people voted for. They put crossbenchers, put a minority government in. They didn't give either party a majority position. So, of course, the people who sit on the crossbenches have a bit more power than they did before. I mean, that's what happened last year.
We didn't have an argument 10 years ago that the Australian Democrats were running the country. That it never came up. It's being done with the Greens because the coalition knows that there is an internal debate and division within the Labor Party about how to deal with the Greens, and that's what manifested itself with this story during the week. And Labor, at both an organisational level and in terms of the government, they can't resolve their conflict between trying to get the votes back they lost to the Greens and at the same time trying to get the votes they lost in the suburbs back. They find those two things very difficult to deal with, and they are very hard to deal with.
With such a low primary vote in the polls, there's little wonder that they'd like to stop the hemorrhage to the Greens. On the other hand, obviously they're trying to keep Middle Australia, except the Greens have not actually demanded that the Labor Party do anything that's not in line with Labor policies or Labor values that I can see.
Yeah.
There's the content of how you do an ETS or whatever, but the Labor Party, and as far as I know, is still the majority of the public, want action on climate change, so that the Greens are not pushing Labor into some position that's a terrible political position.
In fact, if they're nudging Labor in a particular direction, it's probably satisfying Labor supporters more than
certainly on the climate change thing. Yeah.
But Julia Gillard has already, they're starting to make the point that if you think we're being sort of run by the Greens, then we support mandatory detention, we support an alliance with the United States, we don't like death duties and so on. So I guess they'll need to keep bringing up those distinctions.
Differentiations, yeah.
Okay, and just if you're confused about where Bob Brown comes from, he hasn't always been an old-fashioned lefty, apparently. Here he is.
A little secret here, if you turn your microphone off, my first vote was for the Country Party.
See, we all change our minds.
What I don't understand, Bob Brown didn't grow up in Tasmania, did he?
No.
No, that's right. Yeah, that's how he voted. I was trying to work out how he voted for the Country Party.
It would not have been a Country Party in Tassie, that's right. Well, more with our panel shortly. Lenore Taylor, Brian Toohey and Dennis Atkins, but now here's Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.